Welcome to Talk of the Nation, where we're discussing the South Sudan crisis. Now, this crisis continues to rage on as the neighbouring state vacillates from one crisis to another. Uganda's troops, who have been in the war-wracked country, continue to patrol South Sudan. But for how long can they remain involved in this conflict, which seems to spill into a civil ethnic war? To discuss the deployment from an international law point of view is Dr. Busingye Kabumba, who also teaches international law at Makerere University. Good evening, Dr. Busingye.
Good evening, Oksana.
We'll get right into the discussion.
Yep.
I mean, the UPDF went into South Sudan to shore up the fragile regime of President Salva Kiir. Whereas the details of this deployment are shrouded in secrecy, under what arrangement is this anchored in international law?
Well, it must be, and this is the problem with the UN Charter, because you have two clear bases for use of force under the United Nations Charter. One is Article 51, where you say you've been attacked and you have an inherent right self-defense. And so under that article, you can do that, but even that must be limited and must be proportional to the defense, the attack you're facing. The other option is at Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, which is the Security Council deployment. So either you're being attacked and you're defending yourself, or you're responding, acting under Chapter 7 authorization. Now, there are a number of other bases, but those are from a broad and purposive reading of the UN Charter, particularly Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. It says states may not use force against the territorial integrity or sovereignty, the political independence of other states. Now, what some people say is that as long as you're dropping bombs but not affecting the territorial integrity or political independence, you can do that. Or that, for instance, if you're being invited by the head of state, then you're not affecting the independence of that state. Or you're protecting your nationals. That's a form of self-defense under Article 51. So the clearest bases are Article 51 and Chapter 7, but then there are some other defenses or bases you can use which are a little bit more problematic.
Now, this conflict is obviously a conflict of ethnicity.
Yeah.
Is it in order for us to take sides as a country in such a conflict that pits two ethnicities?
Well, from an international perspective, unfortunately, international law seems to be, at the moment, is still state-driven. So we look at South Sudan as a state and start from it from that perspective. We don't look at it initially as ethnicities. So under international law, Museveni, or let's say Uganda, its best defense is that we have been invited by head of state. Now, as whether that is correct politically or morally, that is another matter. But an invitation by head of state, in this case, for better or for worse, is Salva Kiir, is the best cover we can ever have. Unfortunately, of course, is that we don't seem to have this invitation in writing. And that's problematic, because what if Riek Machar wins and then takes us to court, as has been before in DRC versus Uganda? What will our defense be? And for me, that's what troubles me, because we can't raise an understanding, a phone call that may not fly. We might need specific authorization, and that's what seems to be lacking. Do
countries typically do that? I mean, do they receive an invitation via the phone and just go into a country without requiring it to be written down? Is that normal? It's
extremely unsafe. It's definitely not normal. There are instances of verbal agreements and international law, but these are very dubious, especially when talking about use of force. Typically, you need a very clear basis. And as in the past, in DRC versus Uganda, we had a clear basis. We had the consent of Kabila, the former president. And there we were fine until, of course, he said, leave my country. At that point, that defense ended, and we had to use something else, self-defense, which we tried. And we failed because we went into looting. And the court says, the ICJ said in 2005, that, well, you're defending yourself, that's fine. But when you start plundering the country, then you can no longer argue that you're defending yourself. And that's very problematic. So in a sense, we have gotten it wrong. I think in terms of the legal basis, a clear legal basis for our involvement in there.
Can we work backwards and get it in writing?
Yes, and that would be in terms of what they call the articles on state responsibilities. We can obtain ratification of the state to apply retrospectively, but it has to be clear and in writing. And the sooner we do that, the better. I can understand the motivations for getting there, but we need to get it legally correct.
Okay, one of the protagonists in the conflict, Dr. Riek Machar, says that this conflict is largely a political disagreement within the SPLM Politburo. Yes. In a sense, should a neighboring state send a foreign force into Uganda, for example, because there's a disagreement between, for example, our president and Amama Mbabazi?
That's a very interesting question. Because Article 2.7 of the UN Charter says nations should not interfere in the domestic relationships of other states. But at the same time, Article 2.4 really allows, in a sense, if you have consent, you can get in there. Now, the political question is a very important one, because we argued it in DRC versus Uganda. We tried to make arguments based on the territory, the stability of the region. And even now, if you listen very closely to the arguments being made about South Sudan, it's
a regional issue.
Regional issues and brotherliness. And indeed, Objective 28 of our national objectives in the Constitution allow us, they say the foreign policy of Uganda shall be based partly on Pan-Africanism, etc. But at the same time, it says Uganda's foreign policy shall be based on respect for international law. Now, it's problematic to make political arguments in a matter that may have legal ramifications. I'll give you just two instances. In 1980, Iran, in the Tehran hostages case, basically the US was suing Iran over a hostages scandal that had happened there. And Iran tried to argue for the court that, look, this is part of a broader political, a complex history that this court doesn't have the capacity to handle. And the court said, we can excise the legal argument from the political one and deal with the legal argument. Interestingly, 6 years later, the US itself tried to make the same argument against Nicaragua, and it again failed. So these three cases, those two cases and DRC versus Uganda, which is more recent, show that we cannot quite depend on political arguments, as legitimate as they are, to try to get out of a legal problem we've created.
Now, Dr. Busingye, it would appear that interests of the West and the emerging powerhouse China to fish in troubled waters, like South Sudan obviously, seem to be at play. The US Secretary of State John Kerry was in Juba recently to remind the two rival factions that it will not be business as usual. So my question is Uganda punching above its weight?
Well, I'm not as worried of the United States as I am of the United Nations Security Council, because ultimately under the UN Charter framework, it has the primary responsibility for the maintenance of national peace. And it doesn't take very kindly to countries trying to go it alone, trying to be super states in a sense. Our last foreign adventure in the DRC resulted in a loss before the ICJ, and the DRC presented a claim of about $10 billion. Discussions are going on, bilateral discussions under the court supervision to try to get a settlement. But even that sum alone is quite problematic. And as Justice Sobutinda said in September 2013, last year, she said that cost will eventually have to be borne by taxpayers. And she reminded Ugandans not to live under the delusion that foreign adventures don't have domestic consequences. I think that's a very important lesson for us, that we should not see South Sudan as removed from our reality nationally, and that therefore we must be extremely careful as a country to make sure that what we do internationally and what is done in our name as Ugandans doesn't have domestic reverberations. Yes.
Now, we've seen influential regional players like Ethiopia and Kenya take a more cautious approach.
Yes.
IGAD has also failed to marshal a neutral force after this was agreed upon in an IGAD meeting in Addis Ababa. Question is, what next?
Well, and this, for avoidance of all doubt, I respect what our men in uniform and women in uniform are doing. And one also has to respect our president for, in many cases, taking the tough decisions that other countries are shying away from. But that said, and of course, we don't want another Rwanda happening. And there's a very real possibility. I think there's been talk of ethnic killings. So someone has to do something. And Uganda is well placed as a neighbor. We have interests there, economic and otherwise. And therefore, it makes sense, morally and in a sense politically, to be in there. But that intervention should be based on solid legal grounds, and it's very easy to do so. An invitation letter from the sitting president, who is not something that would be controversial in getting. UN Security Council authorization under Chapter 7 would be very easy to get. So I just think we just need to get it right legally so that we can be able to act morally.
Okay, maybe just to wind up the discussion, I mean, our men and women in uniform have no doubt done a great job. I mean, they've restored a semblance of peace. But for how long can they stay in South Sudan without necessarily outliving their stay?
That's a very important question, because we outlived our stay, the welcome in DRC, and we're going to pay for it very heavily. So I think in this case, we just need to find external partners. We need to get South Sudan on board. It's very welcome that last week apparently they've decided to pay for the fuel, which is a sign, might be a sign that there was consent. That would help us in our case. But also I think there's a need to engage more seriously with the African Union mechanism that try to obtain some sort of sanction under the AU, and failing which, or in addition to which, the United Nations. I think that would also, again, not be difficult in coming. So failing those, then of course we could revert back to the defense of invitation. But we need a very solid legal base. I think we need to avoid the mistakes of DRC versus Uganda.
which we seem not to be thinking about
it's
right now.
very problematic.
Okay, we will close the discussion on that note. Thank you so much for joining us on Talk of the Nation tonight.
Always a pleasure.
That was Dr. Busingye Kabumba joining us on Talk of the Nation tonight to discuss the South Sudan crisis. We will take another short break and return with NTV Weekend Sport.